Welcome back from our lunch break with Steve and Lisa. It's almost as if they were there with us again today, and we thank them so much for their permission to play script of what they have done before for us in 2017. At the Civil War Institute that I mentioned to you once before when Nicole was speaking, I told our daughter Stacy, who lives in Lexington, Kentucky, that I was going to the Civil War Institute down in Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. And I said, there's a University of Kentucky professor going to speak. And she said, oh, who's that? And I said, Amy Murrell Taylor is her name. I don't know her, but I just thought you might be interested to have your husband tune in on C-SPAN. And she said, oh, I know who she is. Our children go to school together. Now, that's the only thing I know about her. When I went to the 2019 Institute, I found her name on her name tag and introduced myself to her, told her what we did up here in Springfield in March, and said, I'd like to have you consider speaking in our symposium one day. And she indicated to me that that would be an honor. We had our speakers for 2020. For some of those of y'all who know that we were strapped, because that's right when the beginning of the COVID pandemic began and nobody was really certain of what to do. At the last second, on a Friday, as a matter of fact, 2 of our 3 speakers canceled because their physicians would not allow them to travel in an airplane. I talked with my friend Kent Masterson Brown, and he said, well, I got some things we can do to carry the day. And I said I was going to see if maybe Amy Murrell Taylor could come. And he said that would be excellent if you could. So I called her, and she said, oh, I'm busy. I would love to be there. And today she's here. She's going to speak on Civil War slave refugee camps. As I said, she teaches at University of Kentucky. Her book, Embattled Freedom, Slave Refugee Camps During the Civil War, is an award winner. It's a tremendous work. Nicole talked about it as well. She also wrote a book called The Divided Family in the Civil War, America. I think you're really going to like her, what she's going to say. It's a new work. I'd never heard of a slave refugee camp before in my life. It's an unknown topic to those of us up here in Ohio, I'm certain. But you're going to be informed today. And she's a delightful young lady, and her presentation, she will bring it alive to you. So I would like to introduce to you now, Amy Murrell Taylor.
Well, thank you for such a wonderful introduction. I've been really looking forward to this, as you say, for several years now. It feels like just yesterday we were in Gettysburg, so the pandemic's really kind of messed with my sense of time. So I guess it did take 3 years, but it's really an honor to be here. And what a wonderful session already this morning. I am actually going to pick up on some of the things that Dennis and Nicole have already talked about and take those threads and maybe weave them in some different directions here. But I'm going to talk today about emancipation, and I'm going to take us into the war years. So Dennis got us thinking about the lead up to the Civil War. Nicole got us thinking about the aftermath and the legacy. And I want to take us deep into those war years to talk about emancipation. And first I'm going to share my screen, which, after all this time teaching on Zoom, I should know to do that right away. So here we are. And I assume somebody will tell me if you can't see that. I'm going to assume you can. And I think when I say the word emancipation, if you're a visual thinker like I am and images flash to your mind, it's very possible that something like this just flashed in your mind. And this is the painting by the artist Francis Carpenter, who spent a good deal of time in the White House during the Civil War. And he was there to witness Lincoln when he met with his cabinet. And in this case, painted them, talking about Lincoln's plans to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So this is the first time that Lincoln was sharing these ideas with his cabinet. And I think this image really captures the dominant story that we tend to tell about emancipation during the Civil War. It's a story with Lincoln at the center, with the Emancipation Proclamation at the center. It's the story of a very decisive order, a very decisive moment that brought freedom to enslaved people beginning in January 1st, 1863. And it is an important story. I mean, this is what transformed the purpose of the Civil War, the meaning of the war. The proclamation would transform the futures of nearly 4 million people who were enslaved in 1860. And so this moment, this document has been rightly revered in our culture. I think every year now, the National Archives puts it on display for maybe 1 or 2 days of the year, and there are long lines. Maybe it hasn't happened the last couple of years, but hopefully it will come back. But despite all of this, sometime along the way in my research and study of history, I began to notice that back in the 1860s, photographers who made their way into the South during the war, and thank goodness they did, because boy, did they leave us some treasures behind. But when they went through the South, they started taking some different images of emancipation and sending them back into the North. Is not of what was going on in and around the White House in Washington, D.C., but images of what was going on in and around houses like these. Large clusters of hastily built shacks and cabins and huts, newly built inside the lines of the Union Army, not to house soldiers, as you can see from this picture here from Helena, Arkansas, but to house hundreds of thousands of people, including children, who were fleeing slavery and seeking refuge, people who were refugees from slavery. Well, these images grabbed my attention years ago. They still do. And partly, I think they grab my attention because they point to a disconnect between the story we tell of Lincoln's proclamation, that momentous moment that essentially gave freedom to enslaved people overnight, a disconnect between that and images of people who, under the most dangerous of circumstances, hit the road, escaped slavery, and sought refuge with an army that was waging the most destructive war the nation had ever seen. Freedom didn't just come to these people. They risked their lives to search for it. And they didn't necessarily find it overnight. It was a prolonged effort to find it. So I came to realize that the story of slavery's destruction was more complicated and also involved a massive dislocation of people across the South. And I began to ask why. Why did this happen? Why did it apparently have to happen? And how is this lived and experienced by people who were enslaved one day and now seeking freedom inside a war the next? How was that experience? What was that like? So those are questions I ask in my book, Embattled Freedom, which aims to tell a fuller story of emancipation and how people became free. It's really, I sort of think of it as the story of how emancipation actually worked in daily life. So it's not the story of how freedom was promised to nearly 4 million people and secured legally. That's a story the Emancipation Proclamation tells us. This is the story of how enslaved people themselves made that promise a reality. And so the story begins, as I'll share with you for the rest of my time today, at the war's opening days, in the very beginning of the war. So if you want to follow along with the story of the Emancipation Proclamation, this is over 2 years, or nearly 2 years, I should say, before the proclamation would go into effect. So in the war's opening days, this is when we start to see enslaved people deciding that this war must have something to do with their freedom. And so they set out, they started escaping, and they set out on the region's roads and waterways. Now, the fact that they did this, again, in the war's opening days is pretty remarkable because they're headed towards the lines of the Union Army. But the Union had not said or done anything to invite them and had certainly not encouraged them to flee to their lines. In fact, President Lincoln himself had promised in his inaugural address that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed in the South, which meant he would not help enslaved people to flee. And this in large part because federal law restrained him. There's a provision in the Constitution that many people have not seen or have forgotten about that says that if an enslaved person flees slavery and ends up in free territory, in a free state, they must be returned to their owners. And it was that 1850 Fugitive Slave Act that Dennis talked about this morning, that John Brown hated so much. That Fugitive Slave Act basically created new enforcement mechanisms for that constitutional provision. So Lincoln is bound by federal law, the Union is bound by federal law to, turn away anybody who escapes to Union lines at the beginning of the war. But enslaved people kept pushing, they kept running, they kept going. And though they failed to change the minds of any Union officials early on, when they went to places like Fort Pickens, Florida, and Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., they had more success about 6 weeks into the war when a group of them showed up at Fort Monroe, right there on the coast of Virginia. They showed up at Fort Monroe and they got a meeting with the newly arrived general there, General Benjamin Butler. Now, Butler was not a man who was likely to help them. He was a Democrat. He was not at all an abolitionist. He had no anti-slavery agenda. But the thing about Butler is he wanted to win this war. He was an ardent Union man. And so he listened when, as you can see in this picture in the lower right-hand corner here, when three men in particular showed up in his office one day. And men made an argument. They said, look, if you allow us into Union lines, we will work for the Union Army. We'll do some of that labor that an army needs that will then free up more white men to go serve as soldiers in combat. And they said, this will take labor away from the Confederacy because right now all we're doing is helping the Confederacy and its army get ready for this war. Well, Butler was persuaded. And so he issued an order ordering his men to allow enslaved people inside the lines at Fort Monroe, and said that the Union would protect them as quote unquote contraband of war. Phrasing what Butler had done is he had looked for another legal precedent. Okay, so maybe the Fugitive Slave Act, says we should send people back, but according to the laws of war and the practice of seizing enemy property in a time of war, well, we will just say that we're seizing enemy property, seizing these people as property, and we'll call them contraband, and they can now come and work for us. So that contraband order, it is still classifying people as property. It's not an order that is liberating people per se, but it was a big first step, because what it did was the Union was now saying, hey, enslaved people, flee the Confederacy, flee your plantations. You can come into the lines with us. And Abraham Lincoln quietly approved this order. And soon we see the order or orders like it begin to show up in other places where the Union is taking root in the South. And so what this order did was it essentially opened the floodgates. In the months and years that followed, enslaved people along the coast of Virginia and the Carolinas, across the border states into Kentucky and Missouri, and especially down the Mississippi River Valley, started fleeing, and they went wherever they could find the U.S. Army. About 500,000 people, it's estimated, fled slavery during the Civil War and went into Union Army lines. That, to put in perspective, is about 1/8 of the slave population on the eve of the war. So this is maybe getting closer to the numbers and the scale of rebellion that, as Dennis talked about, John Brown envisioned. It was getting closer. And as you can see from this map, this is a map of places I've been able to locate where there were camps of these refugees from slavery and where they were established. And haven't found the locations of all of them, but I did find that there are about 300 camps in this region. And if you're familiar with the map of Union Army occupation of the South, you can see that these camps really follow that footprint. Times these camps and the refugees took up residence in Union-occupied cities like Nashville, where they might crowd into a burned out building, as we see here, or Richmond. This is from the outskirts of Richmond in 1865. You can see just setting up camp in tents. Sometimes, though, it wasn't urban areas, it was former plantation lands that gave rise to a new refugee camp. To give you some examples of how this really would have transformed the look and function of a plantation. In one example, this is from Middle Tennessee, from Giles County, Tennessee. There were 63 people who had been enslaved on one plantation there on the eve of the war. But a few years into the war, there were now 1,400 people living there in 240 newly built houses. Another one outside Norfolk, Virginia, it was called Taylor Farm. On the eve of the war, there were 11 people enslaved there. But again, a few years into the war, 1,000 people were living there in a series of 200 houses. Some Union officials called these contraband camps, using Butler's language. Others said that that was a term not fit for a human being. So that's some of the more abolitionist-minded Union officials. And they did indeed use the term refugee at the time. Some believed that that was more reflective not only of their status as people, but of their status as people fleeing and seeking protection from persecution. So those led into the camps. Once they got there, one of the first things they wanted to do was to find a way to support themselves economically. And so they did indeed go and work for the Army, as those initial men at Fort Monroe had promised. They got employment working for the Army as heavy laborers. They built roads, they dig ditches, they buried bodies. Some went to work as cooks and as laundresses. That's something women often did. Others worked as guides and sometimes even spies for the Union Army, because who knew the landscape? Who knew even the local Confederates as well as the enslaved population? They had very valuable intelligence that could be shared with the Union Army. So they went to work, they were promised wages, although they were unevenly paid for some reasons I'll come back to. But in some places, some of these camps that were farther removed from combat and were a little bit more isolated, we start to see over the course of the war some of these camps looking a little less transient and a little more permanent. Some of the housing that started to emerge started looking more solid, like you can see in this picture from Camp Nelson, Kentucky. New schools started to emerge in some of these camps, new churches. Missionaries from the north started coming down to help establish churches and schools. Here is one here at Camp Nelson, Kentucky. Examples, pretty prominent examples from the time of some of these camps that really became like new villages of freed people. One was here, this is Hilton Head, South Carolina, in a place called Mitchellville. And this diagram is at the Library of Congress today. And I think just the diagram itself gives you an idea of how some of these camps started to emerge in a less haphazard fashion and a more planned fashion. I mean, here is Mitchellville, which was actually named for the first Union commander who was allowing enslaved people into the lines here, and that was General Ormsby Mitchell. But here you can see the streets, the blocks, the evenly spaced houses. This becomes a much more sort of planned and organized settlement. And here's a photograph of some of the housing there that you just saw on the diagram. Another example, and this is one of, I think, the more intriguing ones, was a village that emerged out of a refugee camp that was built on the property of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, right there in Arlington, Virginia. It came to be known as Friedmans Village. And again, this is an illustration from 1865 that you can get a sense of how some of these really took on the appearance of a small town. There are parks here named after Union officials like Seward, Lincoln Park. The houses are evenly spaced. There's schools, churches again. There's even a hospital. Here is a photograph that shows you what some of those houses look like from Friedmans Village. But some of the other camps proved to be and remained quite transient because some of them were closer to combat all during the war. Or some of them, like those I showed on the map along the Mississippi River Valley, they were vulnerable to floods and were sometimes simply washed away. Others were vulnerable to attacks by Confederate guerrillas. So really the precursor to the Klan, as Nicole talked about, they targeted these camps, set their sights on these camps because they really embodied this social revolution, freedom for enslaved people that they were fighting a war to prevent. So seeing these camps emerge and become to look like a more permanent village was something that they believed had to be attacked. And so as one Union official observed in 1864, there is scarcely one of them at all which has escaped guerrilla atrocities. So as you can hear from that, an emancipation like this that's facilitated by an army at war is going to be a very chaotic, uncertain, and deadly one. And so in my mind, when I started researching this, I want to know, how did people survive in this militarized environment? How did they actually make it out? And so I set out to find some individuals. I wanted to study nobody famous, nobody who's been studied before, but just average, ordinary people who went through this and try to understand their perspective and the day-to-dayness of living this way. I think it's a perspective, the average daily lives of ordinary people. I think sometimes they get lost in some of the histories that we write. And this is something I wanted to make sure and bring out again. But the challenge of doing this with this project was that, the refugees themselves did not leave behind 2-volume memoirs like Grant or a big body of writings like Lincoln. They didn't have the literacy to write. They didn't have the access to publishing outlets. So we don't have very much in the way of firsthand accounts from them. So what I did was, and maybe this is of interest for any of you who do research or maybe even genealogy, was I looked at the records that other people kept, especially the Union Army itself. And what I found, fortunately, was that even though this army was moving through the South, fighting this really destructive war in some pretty awful conditions, they had a wonderful team of clerks who were going along with them, who kept amazing records. I mean, you can just see from this book here, this is a photo from a book at the National Archives of interviews with incoming refugees in Virginia. I mean, you could practically, even with this picture, it may not look that big on your screen, but you can probably read the handwriting. It's so clear. It's been preserved very well. And fortunately, the clerks, they kind of took down everything. They took down, interviews like this. They kept records of laborers who were hired to work for the army and when they worked and how much they were paid. You can see it there as well. And so what I was able to do was see some individuals show up in multiple sets of records like this. And maybe it didn't tell me what they were saying, but it told me what they were doing. And I could begin to connect those dots, just like a genealogist would, and begin to tell their stories. And so I thought I would spend the rest of my time just sharing some of those stories with you of some of these ordinary people and give you a sense of how this whole experience was, how it was lived and how maybe it was felt and what they thought about it. And I want to begin by taking us back near Fort Monroe to Hampton, Virginia. This is just right by Fort Monroe, right next to it. And tell you the story of a couple named Emma and Edward Whitehurst. Now, I don't have a photograph of them. I don't know what they looked like, but I know, again, some things about what they did. The Whitehurst had been enslaved not far from Hampton at Newport News, Virginia. And right when the war breaks out, when those first men show up at Fort Monroe, Emma and Edward Whitehurst, they go to a Union camp as well at Newport News, and then eventually they make their way to Fort Monroe. So they're there by June 1861, just weeks after Butler's order. They began working in the hospitals there. That was another place that hired the labor of these refugees. And they worked as a cook and a nurse. And then Edward volunteered his services to be a guide for the Union Army. So in the Battle of Big Bethel there in June 1861, right on the peninsula in Virginia, he worked as a guide and helped the Union there. But within months, by September 1861, they both exercised their new right to quit their jobs, which was something they could never do in slavery. And they quit their jobs to do something else, which surprised me. They went into Hampton and they opened a store. Now, opening a store was not one of the first things I thought somebody coming out of slavery would do. I mean, it first of all requires some money, some capital to even stock a store to start it. But they figured out a way, and it was actually a really savvy thing to do, because in Hampton, what had happened is many of the Confederates had fled and gone inland. They'd gone to Richmond. And so businesses in Hampton had shut down. And then you've got this influx of Union soldiers into Fort Monroe that are coming in by the thousands. And as you may know, they weren't always satisfied with their food rations. They wanted to buy more food. They wanted to supplement it. So there was this market for food, and the Whitehursts were going to help serve that market. And there were also, of course, fleeing slaves coming into town who would need more food too. So they opened their store by Edward. He went back to their original plantation in a very risky move and collected some of the harvest of the crops that they had grown and brought that in to sell at the store. They also had accumulated some money while enslaved, which sounds a little bit strange that enslaved people would have money, but long story, he had been hired out or rented out by his owner and was allowed to save a small portion of his earnings. And he was saving it to purchase the freedom of his wife and himself. But then the war came, and so now he put that money to different use. So they worked hard beginning in September 1861 to keep their store open and to survive. And their story is really reveals a lot, I think, about how enslaved people just tried to get on their feet economically after they left slavery. And it was a struggle. They faced continual setbacks, and partly because it wasn't just the Confederates that certainly would have loved to have come in and destroyed their store, but it turned out that not everybody with the Union Army was on board with their enterprise. Not everybody was even on board with the whole idea that they should be free. And not everybody in the Union was on board with the idea that the Union should be protecting enslaved people like them. And not everybody in the Union was on board with the idea that ex-slaves like the Whitehursts could set up a store where they claimed to own property that they could sell, the property being the food. Any property in the South, some white Union soldiers and officers argued, was the property of the white men in the South, the Confederates. And the only people who had the right to seize it from them was the Union Army, Union soldiers. They said, these people are contraband. They're property themselves. Property can't own property. So here we get back into that whole tangled thing about people being seen as property that Dennis was talking about this morning. So it turned out that the Whitehurst store was vulnerable to the Union itself. And what would happen is in August 1862, nearly a year after the store had got off the ground, the Union had just failed in its attempt to take Richmond under the command of General George McClellan. This was in the Peninsula Campaign. And as McClellan's troops make their way back down the peninsula to the coast of Virginia, one day, a couple wagons of soldiers show up to the Whitehurst store. They get out of the wagons, they go in, and they start grabbing everything. They grab barrels of flour, bushels of potatoes, even a few pigs that were in a side yard. They took it all out of there, they put it in the wagon, and they left without paying, and they left the Whitehursts with nothing. So there, a year in, the Whitehurst had lost everything and would have to spend the rest of the war getting back on their feet again. Now, there's of course more to the story, but I can't talk for 3 hours. So I'm going to move to another story, which takes place in the Mississippi Valley here in Helena, Arkansas, which is right on the Mississippi River. And it's the story of a woman named Eliza Bogan. Bogan fled her cotton plantation and sought protection in a refugee camp here at Helena. It's what's pictured here. And I should note, maybe you've gathered from what I've said already, but women were a significant part of this refugee population. In fact, in some camps, if you add up the population of women and children, they are the majority of the refugee population. And in Helena, what Eliza Bogan found was a pretty tough situation. You could probably just gather it from this picture here. They're living in old cast-off tents. Sometimes the tents that they had were the ones that the army was no longer using. They're right on the Mississippi River, so they're vulnerable to flooding. And in the summer that she fled, which is the summer of 1863, so this is about a half a year after the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, 1 in 4 people in the camp died that summer because illnesses were raging as well. But it was a refuge in Eliza's mind. It was a refuge from her life on working on a cotton plantation. It was a refuge from her owner, or the man who claimed to own her, whose name was Josiah McKeel. And he, just to give you just a glimpse of what he was all about, he had once been brought to court and tried for cruelty to slaves. Now, there was a lot of cruelty and violence that went, ignored in the slave South. So for something to actually make it into the courts like that, that was pretty bad and tells you a lot. So she fled in July 1863, but in a really difficult sort of wrinkle in her story. When she fled, she left behind her 7 children. She had 7 children. She had 2 husbands, but one had died and one had been sold in the slave trade. What would induce her to flee and leave her children behind? Well, it may be that she tried to take them, and her owner stopped them. Imagine trying to bring 7 children with you when you're making a daring escape. Perhaps she had a plan to come back and get them. She did have a sister who stayed behind, and most likely the children were in her care. But Eliza did flee. She fled. She stayed in Helena for several weeks, but then found that the violence in some ways caught up to her. Because in July 1863, the Confederacy set its sights on Helena and attacked the city in the Battle of Helena in early July 1863. This was part of the Confederacy's attempt to stop the Vicksburg campaign, to stop the Union from making its way to Vicksburg. So they're trying to distract the Union in other places along the Mississippi River, and Helena was one. The Confederates came in, they attacked the town, and they went straight for the refugee camp, and there were some wooden houses, and they burned them all down. The refugees had largely fled in advance of the Confederates arriving, so Eliza Bogan had fled too, and they returned days later to find that their camp had been completely destroyed, which led all of them to start over again. Some got on Union ships and went up to St. Louis, where the Union Army said they would help to resettle them. Others gave up and they said, well, I'm just going to go back to my plantation now. Bogan, though, chose neither of those things. She got herself on a Mississippi River steamboat somehow, I'm not sure how, and she headed south into Louisiana. Now, why did she want to head south into Louisiana, which is really closer to some of the most violent warfare that summer? Well, her third husband, who I hadn't mentioned, named Silas, had enlisted in a Black regiment in the 46th USCT, and that's where his regiment was. And amid everything that she had gone through, and in the absence of her children, she was going to reunite with her husband. She was going to seek that comfort and security. So she found the regiment and she went to work for the regiment. She went to work for his company as a laundress. She was sworn in, she said, into that company, and she became part of their combat apparatus. She went with them from Louisiana to Tennessee to Mississippi to Texas. She witnessed combat. She was vulnerable to guerrilla raids. She nursed men because many of the men in the company would fall ill. She witnessed many of their deaths, including the death of her husband Silas to measles in 1864. And so she would spend the rest of the war simply trying to stay alive amid all of this, threat and violence and illness. I think her story really reveals a lot about how becoming free in the war could require living amid active combat and having to fight for, one's survival just as a means to become free. All right, finally, I'm just going to quickly take us to one last story, and that's not far from where I'm sitting today. This is Camp Nelson, Kentucky. This is in Jessamine County, Kentucky. And I'm going to move forward in time to the summer of 1864. So this is a year and a half after the Emancipation Proclamation has gone into effect. But in Kentucky, the proclamation didn't mean anything because the proclamation only freed enslaved people in rebellious territory, and Kentucky was a Union state. It was a slave state, but it was still a Union state, and so the proclamation did not apply. And so here I want to tell you the story about how a man named Gabriel Burdett navigated that complex situation. And his story really begins back in slavery too, in Garrett County, Kentucky, where he was enslaved for over 30 years. And in that time became a minister. He became a preacher and would preach on his plantation to fellow enslaved people. And then eventually over time, his owners brought him to their church, which was the Forks of Dix River Baptist Church, a white governed and controlled church. And they allowed him to preach with some supervision. Well, it was a lot of supervision because for a white church to allow a Black preacher in to preach, and he was going to preach to fellow enslaved people, they wanted to make sure that he didn't go a little off the rails or didn't try to incite any kind of rebelliousness. We don't know exactly what Gabriel Burdett did in those circumstances, but in 1862, clearly he did something he wasn't supposed to do, because the daybook from the church says this: "We are informed that Brother Gabriel used publicly very objectionable language, casting reflections and slurs upon the church and evincing a disposition to claim higher privileges than can be granted or tolerated." So he was brought before the church and punished and forced to apologize for whatever he had done. There is good reason to suggest that perhaps he was preaching a more anti-slavery message, and perhaps that was what was so objectionable. So that's his background. So that's 1862. The war's going on, and he is still in the confines of this white church. Well, a year later in 1863, he makes his way to Camp Nelson, Kentucky, so not too far from his church. And but he made his way there not voluntarily. He was impressed into service in the Union Army. This is another thing that went on because of Kentucky's peculiar position as a slave state that was pro-Union. The Union Army there needed the labor of enslaved people, just like they did in Virginia. But instead of allowing them to come in and liberate them, they couldn't do that. So instead, the Army went out and said to various plantation owners, "We need your slaves. Send them to us and we will pay you for their labor." So Gabriel Burdett goes to Camp Nelson to work for the Union Army, but his owner is going to be paid for his labor. Well, that might have seemed kind of discouraging to Burdett, but what Burdett learned pretty quickly is that an Army camp was actually a much freer and open space for his religious preaching and expression than the white church had been, because the Army was a little bit indifferent to the religious worship of its soldiers and to the enslaved. And he found that even as he was working as an impressed laborer, he could start preaching to other enslaved men and say whatever he wanted. Well, he stayed at Camp Nelson. He stayed for the next 2 years of the war and worked to establish a church and even a school for soldiers at Camp Nelson. And he worked with a missionary who arrived, maybe familiar to some of you, named John Fee, who was the founder of Berea College in Kentucky. The two of them, they thought a lot alike. They both believed and both preached anti-slavery Christian beliefs. They believed the Bible was not pro-slavery, even though plenty of people in the South believed it was. And they were also committed to non-sectarianism. So they wanted to form churches, independent churches that were not part of existing denominations. They came to believe that the traditional denominations had been sort of warped and tainted by pro-slavery people, so they needed to start their own independent churches. And so they did. As Burdett wrote after the war, the colored people in the state were once all members of white slaveholding churches. I have never been able to see how we could be independent without coming out entirely from all the old slaveholding churches and form an independent church of our own. And so, that again is what he did. So at Camp Nelson, he and Fee and others, they established a church, they established a school, they established this village, as you can see here, 100 cottages lined up in rows, and came to call this the first free spot of ground in Kentucky. And he started building a whole vision of the future based in this place, that this was the beginning of a new village and a new place where Black people could live freely in Kentucky. So he was determined to hold on to this place and hold on to this space. But that's where his story takes a turn, and where the story of all of these camps takes a turn at the war's end. And so here I want to get to 1865 and 1866. And again, there's so much more to the story that I could tell you. But the big question would be, what would happen to these camps? What would happen to these spaces that were becoming really, they really kind of embodied a whole new South, where Black people were living independently in their own communities. And these are places that the residents of these camps wanted to hold on to. But from the Union's point of view at the end of the war, there was a problem with this whole idea that they would stay. In most places, the lands on which these refugees were settled were precisely the same confiscated and abandoned lands in the Union's possession that now were under debate. Should these lands that the Union had seized and occupied be returned to Confederate owners in the interest of reunion and sectional reconciliation, or should the lands remain in the Union's hands and be leased or sold to freed people and others? Of course, the residents of these camps believed the Union should hold on to this land. And initially, the Union listened. Famously, General William T. Sherman acquired a large swath of land, 400,000 acres, on his march to the sea. And he listened to a group of Black ministers in Savannah who convinced him that this land had to be turned around and made available to newly freed people. And so Sherman issued an order to that effect, that this land should be carved up in parcels of land that were 40 acres. Well, then the new federal agency established at the end of the war, the Freedmen's Bureau, to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom, they took up the task of actually handing out this land. So things looked promising at first, but it all changed with the ascension of a new president in 1865, Andrew Johnson, who proved far more sympathetic to ex-Confederates and who, in the interest of sectional reconciliation, stopped these efforts in their tracks and ordered all the land returned to their Confederate owners. Not just Sherman's land, but all the lands that these camps were on throughout the South. And the Freedmen's Bureau he charged was now going to have to turn around and get into the business of evicting all of these people from these villages and these camps. Well, the residents were not going to go quietly. They held public meetings. They hired lawyers. They pooled together their wages and hired lawyers. They made public appeals in newspapers. They appealed to members of Congress. Residents of Edisto Island, South Carolina, gathered that fall and wrote President Johnson a letter urging him to reconsider. They said, you can't give the land back to white Confederates because they will never sell it to us. They will never rent it to us. There's no way we'll be able to get our hands on it. In their letter, they condemned white landowners as land monopolists. They explained that land monopoly is injurious to the advancement of the course of freedom. The land has to be broken up. They said, we are ready to pay for this land. Shall not we, who are freedmen and have been always true to this union, have the same rights as are enjoyed by others? In other words, why are you recognizing the rights of people who fought against the union? We have a right to this land. And what they're also saying is, we don't want to give it to us. We want to buy it or rent it. Well, they ultimately lost. Johnson didn't listen. And only in a couple exceptional cases did the land stay in the hands of these settlements. And it was in the cases where the land was owned by particularly conspicuous ex-Confederates, Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. Their lands remained settlements for freed people. So Friedmans Village, as I showed you, remained in place after the war, but most others were evicted. The ending exactly, because emancipation did not, I think we all know, lead to full and unfettered freedom, equality, and rights, as Nicole has already talked about today. The struggle for rights and equality would continue. But I think this moment shouldn't be forgotten either, even if it was stopped in its tracks, because I think it tells us a lot about how emancipation and freedom came about. It tells us a lot about the great risks that hundreds of thousands of people took to become free. It tells us about the role that African Americans themselves played in securing their freedom. This was not simply something that was granted and given out. So I will stop there for now. Much more to say, but I do appreciate having the chance to share the story and share the story of these people with all of you.
Yes, Amy. I don't know if I'm on the screen or not, or if you can hear. I got a couple of questions, two silly ones and one respectable one. As a Duke University graduate, were you a Cameron crazy with Coach K in your eyesights?
I was a Cameron crazy. I slept in tents too, but
really?
To watch basketball, not to gain freedom. But yes, I was.
Well, you know, this is his last game coached at Cameron, so just
it's a big season, big day. Yeah.
Your transition from the Duke University to Albany, then down to UK. Did you find University of Kentucky basketball fans accepting you as a Duke person? Just out of curiosity, because
well, I sort of kept it quiet when I got here.
I wondered.
And one day but it was on my website. So, you know, if anybody wanted to find out, they could. And one day I showed up in class and the student looked at me, he goes, "We know about you."
I just wondered.
Told the whole class. And anyway, they gave me a lot of grief, but people are good sports about it. And I've come to really appreciate Kentucky fans' loyalty to their team. It's a very different kind of loyalty than Duke fans' loyalty to their team. I think it means a lot more to the state than Duke basketball means to North Carolina. So that's been something I can appreciate.
I know our son-in-law and I banter back and forth between the two. He's a UK law school grad, so it's a difference.
Yeah.
Here's a serious question. I don't mean to be making small talk and taking up your time, but what prompted you on your title for the book, as writing about slave refugee camps? In some of our ignorance up here, we never even heard of them until you brought the subject up. What prompted you to study that, to bring that to attention?
Yeah, so I have been researching other things. I mean, you mentioned I wrote this book on divided families. And so, you know, as anybody who researches knows, whenever you're in an archive and going through sources, you're always seeing other things that aren't really related to what you're trying to research and write about, but that pique your interest and get your attention. And I just kept coming across, you know, newspaper articles, but also photographs, like some of the ones I showed you. There was one photograph I showed of the wagon and all the people around it. And I remember thinking, I don't understand, I don't know the story. I can't tell the story of this photograph. I don't really know who these people were and what they were doing. And so I really wanted to be able to tell that story and figure out, like, what is this that went on? And so it was that sort of curiosity. And yeah, I just ended up wallowing in military records for a number of years to figure out what was there, and have come to realize it was a whole much bigger story than I ever expected. And I think there's going to be a lot more work done on it to really tell the full story.
Your other book that you wrote in 2005, I can't remember the name of it.
The Divided Family in Civil War America.
Was that your thesis for your doctorate?
That was my doctoral dissertation.
Did you have to make much change for it to be published from your doctoral thesis at all?
Somewhat. I don't remember it being too onerous, but you know, doctoral dissertations, if anybody's taken a look at one, they're often very academic-y and you know, are sort of checking some boxes about what you need to demonstrate to receive a PhD. And so I did have to revise it to make it a little bit more of a story, and something that something in my mind my parents wanted to read, because I certainly didn't give them my dissertation. So
yeah, it's not very often the dissertations are published, as you probably well know, because it's hard to make them so that those of us that are just regular old learners can understand what you write, because your academia is pretty up there and we're a little bit below that.
Yeah. I think those of us who do research about the Civil War do appreciate audiences like this, and the fact that there's so much interest outside of academia in this subject. And I think it's a real honor and a real pleasure to be able to have that exchange.
I'll turn this over to Natalie now. She might have some questions for you from the attendees, and I will get off the screen and let you spend time with Natalie, perhaps.
All right,
thank you so much for coming. We really appreciated it. It was a thrill, and good to see you again as well. So perhaps
great to be here.
Paths will cross again. But thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. It's really fascinating. I was thinking, I took 2 specifically classes on the Civil War in undergraduate and grad school, and I never knew any inkling of anything about slave refugee camps. So I'm really interested in reading your book.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of good, not to interrupt you, but there's, a lot of good reasons, and this gets back to Nicole's talk too, for why this history hadn't really been remembered very well over time. Part of it goes back to how I ended, with the fact that, they're physically erased from the landscape. So there isn't the remnants and the ruins to help, but there's also, of course, a real sort of intended, concerted effort to minimize the position of slavery and enslaved people in this story.
Well, there's a question asking if there are any other slave encampments like Camp Nelson that are designated as national monuments.
Yeah, so Fort Monroe, actually. So Fort Monroe became a national monument a few years before Camp Nelson. So Fort Monroe was under President Obama, so sometime there. And it received that designation because of this slavery history. So that's one example, and they have recently opened a museum there and are doing some wonderful interpretive work there. So that's another one. What's really been interesting is in the last, I would say, 15 or so years, a lot of local communities have really organized to try to figure out ways to commemorate and remember this history, and to even interpret the actual sites where these camps were. So other examples are Mitchellville, South Carolina, that I talked about. They're a wonderful group of people who were descendants of Mitchellville residents who are still living on or around the island, combined with retirees who have come to Hilton Head who have money and resources, and they've sort of joined forces and have created a historic site there. And the city of Hilton Head has actually donated the land, which was great. Other places, Helena, Arkansas has created a park where the refugee camp stood. There are these concrete paths that go through the park, and they've put footprints in them of all different sizes. And so you get a sense of like the children and the people who once walked that ground. It's really powerful. Corinth, Mississippi, Alexandria, Virginia. So those are some of the places, maybe not National Park Service designations yet, but where we're starting to see this building. And again, it's just been in the last 15 years or so.
That's really interesting. Say another question was if there was any remnants left, and you said there really isn't.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, like, okay, at Camp Nelson, there is a house that was an antebellum house and it became the military headquarters, and it's still standing. So, I mean, kind of, but in terms of, you know, the things I showed in the pictures, those kinds of houses, that stuff just doesn't remain. So what's going on is, fortunately, as I said, the military keeps really wonderful records. And so in some places, there are diagrams of what the houses going up looked like. There's measurements. And so there's the ability to recreate some of these villages. And that's what they've done that at Camp Nelson, which is one of the houses. And, you know, it helps, but, you know, it's going to be impossible to really visualize and feel what it was like. But one could say that's true. You know, we face that sort of limitation on a battlefield as well.
We have another question. Did any of the slave refugees accept combat roles? For example, a number of African Americans are listed among the personnel of Sherman's escort unit, the 1st Alabama.
Yeah, so it's interesting. This story I tell kind of like intersects with the story of Black enlistment and the Emancipation Proclamation, but it's not, doesn't follow along exactly together. But yes, over time, when Black enlistment is allowed in the Union, some of these men enlist. And, you know, some of them stay still doing military labor, you know, but they've now got the uniform, which in and of itself is meaningful. And they also, you know, have secured their freedom, because that is one thing one gets when one enlists in the Army. So one thing I didn't mention about Gabriel Burdett's story, so he's at Camp Nelson, he's an impressed slave. But in Kentucky, one thing that does happen is about in the last year of the war, Black men are allowed to enlist. So it's much later than in other places, but eventually they need them in combat roles. And so men start enlisting in Kentucky, and Gabriel Burdett is one of them. And that's how he actually first gets his legal freedom. He is detailed to stay at Camp Nelson to work with the refugee home, but he eventually is activated and ends up in Texas. So, but yeah, the men do fight in combat. And, you know, as I argue, somebody like Eliza Bogan, maybe she's not a soldier, but the kind of labor she's doing right there on the front lines, she's pretty immersed in combat as well.
Well, thank you for sharing this story and for talking with us. We're going to go into another break now, and then we'll come back and we'll hear from Dr. Tom Taylor about the Emancipation Proclamation, more about that story.
All right. Thank you.
So, thank you. Okay. And we've got a little bit more music for you while we wait for the next one. So we'll be back at 2:15 with Dr. Tom Taylor. Thank you.